Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is David Linton, author and economist. David has worked as a director of portfolio construction, manager of research at Pacific Life, and a vice president of portfolio manager at PIMCO, one of the top investment firms in the world. David is no stranger to higher ed. He's taught at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business and is about to start a new gig teaching at UT Austin. David's written 2 books. Foundations of Investment Management has become a mainstay among aspiring professionals who want to bridge the gap between an academic understanding and practical application of investment management strategies, and his latest is Crushed: How Student Debt Has Impaired a Generation and What to Do About It. This examines the problems with student loan debt. David joins us today to talk about what universities must do to graduate students on time, career-ready, with little or no debt. David, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Drumm, for having me.
My pleasure. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. This is fortuitous. You have a book coming out called Crushed: How Student Debt Has Impaired a Generation and What to Do About It. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about you. You know, our audience wants to know who you are and why did you write this book?
Yeah, thanks very much. And that's a great question. So I am an economist and investment manager as part of my day job. My background is in asset management, and I currently work for a large multinational firm managing their cash and investments. And before that, I've worked at PIMCO and Pacific Life in a portfolio management role. But what drew me into this topic and into this field and into academia more generally was 4 years ago, I wrote my first book, Foundations of Investment Management. And the idea of that book was to try to bridge the gap between a formal education and what people in my capacity should really know the first day that they join the firm. And so with that, I was able to start teaching as well. So I spent a little bit of time teaching at the University of Southern California, evening MBA students. I taught an investments class. And now I have since moved to Austin, and I will be teaching a similar class at UT at the McCombs School of Business. The impetus to write the book on student debt in particular and post-secondary education more broadly really came when I was onboarding as a faculty member at USC. So I had gone to USC as an undergrad 20 or so years earlier, and I thought the campus was beautiful then, and the school and education was wonderful then. But every change that they had made since then was just amazing. The buildings were great. The lawn was even better manicured. Like every facility was top notch, and the price was expensive then, and now it's really expensive. And so I asked a lot of people in the ministry, it's like, why is this going on? Why is this so expensive? Why is this so nice? And what I discovered is it's really not unique to USC at all. It's indicative of every flagship school and almost every other post-secondary school in the nation. You know, thousands of institutions all kind of feel this pressure to have better, not just education, but experience. And so I couldn't get these questions out of my head. Why is this so expensive? Why is there so much debt? What are the motivations? Is this optimal? And it was kind of through the lens of an economist that I tried to answer all these questions. Around the same time, I overheard a podcast with Elon Musk, and he was joking about how when he designed the Model S, not for other people, but he designed the car that he wanted to drive. And so I kind of wrote the book Crushed as a book that I'd want to read. It kind of answers all these questions that I had about what's going on and why.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because going back to your experience at USC, you know, not only teaching, but as an undergraduate, did you find the education was any better when you came back?
You know, I think the quality of faculty was similar, maybe a little bit better in terms of the objective metrics like years of tenure or experience or papers published. The classrooms were nicer, they were brighter, they were newer, there was more technology available to them. The students were similar and maybe a little bit better. Their incoming SATs and GPAs were even higher. But in terms of the skills that people left with, they were probably pretty similar.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because right now we've got 1.7 trillion with a T in student debt. Would have been a little less except for the Supreme Court.
Right.
Oh well, we'll just blame SCOTUS for all the problems. Not an issue.
Right.
Has the cost of college gone up that much over what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago?
Yeah. No, and that's a great place to start because that was the first thing I started looking into when I was researching my book. Student debt is the amount of student debt is a function of how much people borrow, and people borrow the difference between what they have to pay and what they can afford. So looking at the data, in 1969, the cost of a public school college education was $1,545, which was 19% of the median household income.
Was that per year or total?
Per year.
Okay.
Yeah. In 2020, that was now just under 29,000 or 42% of the median household income. That's about 2.5 times more expensive as a function of household income. On an inflation-adjusted metric going from 1969 to 2020, it was between 3.5 and 4 times as expensive, which means that the cost of 4 years in 1969 was basically the cost of 1 year in 2020. And so when you put in that context, it makes perfect sense that people are taking out debt because with the exception of maybe the top 5% of income earners in America, it's outside the range of affordability.
Mm-hmm. Now, is this cost per student or is this cost to student? There's a difference.
I think it's both. The cost per student has gone up a lot, but the cost for each student that comes in has gone up a lot as well. And that's really driven by the breadth of the increase in services and things that universities now offer. Whereas in the past, the primary focus was student instruction and the secondary focus was admin. Now we have nicer campus facilities, larger research departments, other public services to outside the community, and other ancillary services that schools offer. So if you think about what was a college in the year 1800, it was very bare bones. There was a dorm and a library, a lecture hall, maybe an admin building. And that's basically it, 4 or 5 buildings.
Well, we also needed stables for the horses. Come on.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't have to have multiple parking lots for automobiles. Right. There was one stable.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I'm sure student work was probably an adjacent farm that you could go to try
Absolutely.
to make ends meet.
Why do you think we have an agrarian calendar?
Oh yeah. No, that it all comes together so nicely. So the services that are offered to students have really increased in the cost to the student. And I'm not trying to cast any judgment. We're saying it's right or wrong or good or bad. It's just simply the reality of the situation, that the cost to maintain the facilities on your typical flagship university is an order of magnitude higher than it was 20, 30, 50 years ago. The cost of student instruction has gone up surprisingly, despite the technology and ability, but I think that's a function of class sizes generally being smaller, particularly since the 1970s. And administrative expenses have gone up as well, more administrators per student. And then lastly, more services available, particularly medical and more recently mental health services available to students. And again, that's not a judgment call. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad or we should or shouldn't offer those. It's simply when looking at the data, what are the drivers of these increased costs? This is what I discovered.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got, campuses, especially flagships, are small cities.
Yeah.
The president is the mayor of the city. He has a city council, his board of directors.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You've got all of these things. But I also have to wonder on the cost side, and I'm sure we'll dig into it a bit. if part of it has to do with public support of higher education, the amount of support states used to give was anywhere from 50 to 70%. Now, if you're getting 12%, you're doing really, really well. The other piece with that is the median income for folks paying for college, whether, mostly parents, et cetera, it hasn't grown at the same level as one would expect, especially over the last 30 years. How do those factors play in?
Yeah, so I think what you initially speaking to is the declining public support hypothesis for the cause of tuition inflation. And in 2017, Professor Douglas Weber of Temple University, he tested that hypothesis. And what he found is that roughly for every $1,000 in budget cuts, students pay an extra $3 or $350 more per year in tuition and fees. So there is definitely a direct correlation. So whenever budgets are cut, tuition does go up, but it's only by 30-ish%, which means the other 70% is coming from something else. And it only explains part of it. And there's a series of other theories at different end of the spectrum. The Bennett hypothesis, Secretary of Education William Bennett under Reagan, I think he's still on Fox News. He penned an op-ed in the New York Times about greedy colleges. And basically the argument was that colleges raise tuition because student loans are made available to them. And in 2015, the Federal Reserve of New York released a paper, Credit Supply and the Rise of College Tuition. The data seemed to suggest that it was largely correct, that colleges increased the sticker price by about 60 cents and reduced grants by about 20 cents for every $1 of incremental student loans that were made available. We can combine the two, the Bennett hypothesis and the declining public support hypothesis, and we get a more complete picture, but that's still kind of an academic explanation. These are data that you're going to tease out. What I really think is that from speaking to administrators and presidents and others, the story that comes out is they all care about things like rankings and performing well vis-a-vis their competitors. They know what colleges the other students that apply to them apply to, and they care about having a similar or better college experience. And that's always been top of mind. They want to have not just a higher GPA and SAT for incoming classes, but they also want the students to, when they're there, to really have a great experience. The beautiful facilities, great lectures, great teachers, good athletics, great facilities, medical available to them, great food. I know we joked about this. It has created something of an arms race between colleges as they look at each other and they want to be as good or better than the colleges that they're looking at on either side of them. Again, that's not a judgment call. It's not saying that that's good or bad, but it is certainly a big motivation that's contributed to increasing tuition prices.
Well, it's also, you hear plenty of stories about the lazy rivers or the climbing walls, et cetera, et cetera. And
it's funny, actually, we didn't talk about this before the call, but I had the picture of the lazy river in my book. And this is a true story. I was writing the chapter and I had a picture of the lazy river, and my then 8-year-old daughter walks in. She's like, "Daddy, what are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm writing about the cost of college." She's like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's LSU." She's like, "It just says LSU." I'm like, "No, that's a lazy river." And she's like, "Oh my God, can I go to LSU when I go to college?" And I'm like, "Wow, this was really effective." 10 years from now, my daughter is going to apply to LSU simply because of that lazy river.
She's got the subconscious memory of it. And there you go.
She sure will. And I'll be honest, if I were a kid, I'd want to go to LSU or another school with a lazy river. That would be awesome. Can't blame them.
Well, if somebody from LSU is listening to this podcast, you've got a student coming up at, let's see, this is 2023, so possible recruit for the class of 2037.
Yeah, right.
So public support's dropped. Arms race, beautiful campuses. There's a lot of other things in there as well, though. You've got more regulations, more administrators, etc. There's a lot of things I know could be done about this, but one of the things that we've chatted about is really, what is the purpose of higher ed? You mentioned something before we came on the air about how many institutions actually think about cutting costs.
Right.
I was more than a little shocked.
Right. So I've spoken with a number of administrators and I talked to them about, their budgeting processes and what they look to do and how they look to accomplish it. And regularly, some of the things that they focus in on more publicly is 3-5 years, what departments will expand, or hiring new faculty, or building a new building once a year or every other year. And I always ask the question, how important is cost rationalization? Is one of your top 5 priorities delivering the same quality education or same quality experience, but at 2% less every single year? And I've never had anybody say, yes, that's very important to us. More of, no, we have a budgeting process and each department has to fit within their budget and, there's a back and forth. But I've never seen or heard of any president provide a mandate that says every department has to have the exact same quality service at inflation minus 2% for the next 5 or 10 years. It's an incremental approach, which is why I like it, but it's also something that I've seen in corporate America, and I'm sure corporations and businesses outside. People and managers are tasked. How do you do more with less? You have 10 employees. Can you have 9? You have 8 software providers. Can you do the same with 6? You're proposing this project. Can we defer it for 3 years and see if we need to revisit it? I think if that mandate came from the top, that this is a priority to maintain the quality and each year get incrementally more efficient, then it could be implemented. Now, I hope you have him on, John Katzman. He founder of Princeton Review. We had a number of conversations, and he's on the record for saying that he thinks up to a third of overall expenses in universities could eventually be cut without damaging experience of education, experience while there. But rather than taking a dramatic approach of just jettisoning departments, being very specific about finding out, can we run this building more efficiently? It's at 30% capacity. Can we increase it to 50%? These dorms are vacant for 4 months of the year. Can we do something with that facility? This building needs maintenance, but can we defer it for 5 years because we're anticipating replacing the building altogether?
Oh, deferred maintenance. There's billions of dollars in deferred maintenance that needs to happen.
Right.
John can take that one off the table right now.
Okay. I don't want to
People are already doing that one.
Right. And so I think the idea, the Six Sigma approach, is that you just get incrementally better constantly over a very long period of time. And the other approach that I think presidents would at least maybe consider is, it's very challenging, I imagine, if you're a president and you're going to go out on your own. Now, there are a few specific examples of schools saying we're not going to raise tuition or we're going to cut costs. But the big fear for presidents is that they put themselves at a competitive disadvantage. Now, again, right or wrong, they care a lot about rankings and how they compare and how they look versus their competitors. And if one school says we're going to maintain or cut expenses and cut tuition, and all of their competing schools, or all the schools that they look most closely to, are not, they're going to be fearful of falling behind, and probably for very good reason. Mm-hmm. So I think if a broader group, all Pac-12 schools or all schools in the Midwest that liberal arts that happen to compete with one another, and these schools know who they are, and the presidents know who they are, if they collectively come together and say, we will announce we are not going to raise tuition by more than inflation each year for the next 10 years. And it comes back to the schools and the departments figure out how to do more with less every single year, that it's much more palatable. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think if that becomes the norm, it will help the schools regain the initiative and take back over the broader discussion. You can kind of sense the winds in the nation that there's more and more frustration towards post-secondary education, right or wrong. But if the schools start controlling the narrative by announcing these voluntary caps or raises of tuition, I think it provides them an opportunity to gradually make changes without any kind of really dramatic policy change, whether it's jettisoning tuition or debt or departments or anything like that. So I think there'd be a lot of benefits to that kind of leadership.
And that makes a lot of sense. One of the challenges that I think we've seen is there's a lot of different things going on. There's policy decisions that need to be made, institutional decisions. But the purpose of higher ed is changing, at least from a perception perspective. It used to be for the public good, good citizens, et cetera, get yourself ready for the job. It's becoming more job ready. That's the main focus now. But I think we need to look at it even differently, don't we?
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think that looking at history, there's kind of like been this pendulum swinging back and forth, going all the way back. Are colleges to train the clergy, or are they to, help farmers grow more tobacco? And the focus has changed every 50 or so years in the country. I think that going back to the 60s and 70s, there may have been a big push for national reasons. They wanted more mathematicians and engineers for a space race. But that led to dramatic increase in demand and increase in price. And now the focus seems to be again on the financial component when you graduate. That's almost been forced by the fact that it's simply so expensive. Not to say English lit major is not valuable. It's very valuable. And I think that if English literature or education or social services is your passion, you should pursue that. But with the incremental earnings with that degree mean that this may be a negative rate of return on the cost of the education, then that's a completely different conversation about should we encourage people to go and take this path. And hopefully, if the overall tuition falls and the cost of the education falls, we can again encourage people to go to better themselves and better society and think about jobs kind of secondary as a tertiary consideration. But if with this financial commitment, I think it becomes top of mind for most households.
So if we're looking at institutions are looking at maximizing the number of people who graduate on time, that they're ready to join the job force and to leave a productive life.
Yeah.
I think we toss in one more, that they can repay their debts with a minimum problem.
Right.
Now, do I sound like an economist?
Yeah, well, yeah, no, I think you do. And, if the last component of repaying debt with minimum concern, that speaks to all sorts of benefits to both the individual and society if we're able to accomplish that. To go off on a bit of a tangent, there's a growing body of research on what student debt actually does to young adults. And I wrote a whole chapter about it, trying to summarize this whole body of literature. And there are adverse consequences in more ways than you'd otherwise think. People with student debt, they have lower GPAs. They have more mental health issues, both while in college. When they graduate, they're less likely to buy a house. They get married later. They have children later. They're less likely to start a business. They're more likely to go into a high-paying job that they otherwise don't want. They're less entrepreneurial, less likely to start a business. And so as a result of this, society is hurt when you give people in their early and mid-20s $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 in debt. So when we think about removing that impediment or that burden on young adults, it helps both society as well as the individual. And so that's why I think it's such an important topic. But it doesn't have to be dramatic. There are ways presidents, I think, can focus in on that. Now, I do know that a couple of years ago, U.S. News and World Reports added graduation indebtedness to one of their criteria for rankings. And I think that that's great. It's 5%, or at least last time I looked it up. Hopefully they can increase that consideration, and it will help schools, again, reprioritize getting students through with minimum debt. Because I think that really is a public good, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll tell you, a lot of the presidents that I speak to, especially on the podcast, it is becoming more and more top of mind on how we can hold the line on student debt. We can reduce it. We can get graduates. I had a conversation with someone today that they pride themselves on getting students graduated on time, with little or no student debt. Yeah. And their placement rate for jobs within 6 months of graduation is 92%. I mean, that's excellent. Is fabulous. That is fabulous. We'll be doing a podcast on that here in in a few weeks. So tune in, folks.
Well, you've got one listener, so I can take a mental note of where I should send my 3 kids, because that's important.
So this is, I tend to like big picture policy kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much from a university perspective we can do with the policy other than, our votes.
Right.
But we're not speaking, again, as an economist.
Right.
People respond to incentives.
Right.
So what is the incentive structure that a president should have besides wanting to do good? Other industries have had the same thing, from a policy perspective, government, you've got the CAFE standards, et cetera,
right.
et cetera. What can boards do? What can presidents do? Which is kind of leading us into the last question, or one of the last questions I always ask is 3 takeaways for university presidents. But, frankly, what can boards and presidents do to hold the line on tuition? Why is it important for them? Why is it important for their students?
Right. I think that the adage that what is measured is managed is very applicable here. Do colleges even know the average debt per student when they graduate and the degree to which they've been able to pay it off in 5 or 10 years? If the answer is no, I think first step is to figure out exactly what that is. And then, if you're on the board of a university, establish an objective. If you discover that 30%, 40, 50% of students 10 years out are unable to repay their debt, one objective can be to the president somehow improve that. And that can be a very hard objective to reach, but once it's measured, they can look into the data. So if there are certain types of students that are unable to pay, certain academic thresholds that if you do or don't cross, you're unlikely to graduate or take out more debt. Are there certain types of areas of study where students are more or less successful when it comes to repaying their debt or not having debt? And if the objective is very clearly established, that within 5 years, your delinquency rate of student debt will drop from 20 to 10%, or your graduation rate will increase from 70 to 80%, and the amount of debt at graduation will decrease from 30K to 20K. And the board set these objectives for the presidents. These will be very difficult objectives to reach, but at least it now becomes at the top of a hierarchy of priorities that presidents and their administrators and department heads will have to cope with. So it would start at the top, establish what the real objective is, how you're going to measure that, and then let the people kind of figure out how they can best achieve that.
That is a fabulous suggestion, especially in light of what I've heard from multiple guests recently about students not willing to go to college because they're unwilling to take on debt. I mean, we're seeing this more and more with Gen Z folks, is they'll go, well, I'm not willing to take on $30,000, $40,000 worth of debts, so I just won't do it. They don't stop and think about the benefits for the college education. They're thinking more short-term than long-term.
Right.
Even so, to grow enrollment, you've got to have these things top of mind, and students really care about it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And there are more and more students that I imagine, the Gen Zers that I've talked to, that know people that are 5, 10 years older than them that have had really adverse outcomes. They didn't finish their degree. They went to a for-profit school and they left. Now they've $20,000 in debt and they don't have a better job. And so there's any number of ways that people get discouraged. I think changing the narrative, being able to demonstrate objectively. I remember when my parents were taking me to college and they're like, what's the dollar value of this? Is $25,000 a year really worth it? $20,000? And that was a non-trivial percentage of their salary. Now it's even higher. So the answer has to be yes. Here's the data. Here are the numbers. Here's why we think your student will be able to take out X amount and repay that within Y years. And here's the evidence of the people that do it. Oh, and by the way, if they study this and take this minor, they've got an even better chance of repaying in full and on time. And we care about that, and we will follow up with your student or your son in the future to make sure that they've got the tools that they need, because we care that everybody, not just once they're in, but once they're out, is better off. And measuring that, managing it, making that an objective from the board to the president to the department heads to the professors, I think that that can go a long way in improving outcomes.
I think you're absolutely right. So that's one takeaway, is board setting very BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goals.
Right.
As far as graduates with debt, et cetera, et cetera. Two more for presidents and boards. Two more takeaways, what things they can do.
Most schools have a kind of annual or semi-annual process whereby they look at objectives, they look at ideas of things they're going to do in the pipe, whether it's new buildings or facilities or staff or department, like big, broad changes, and then they rank order. Cost cutting should be on the top 5. And it doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be freeze budgets or maintain or have budgets increase at inflation minus 1% every single year, and force the department heads to figure out a way to work within that framework.
The Six Sigma approach.
Yeah, exactly. And as part of that, I'm sure that any school with a business department may appreciate that, because suddenly every professor that's not in the business department will want to see what Excel models with the NPV calculations they can have to then use that framework to put forward ideas. Be like, yes, university president, we would like to build this building, and here are the assumptions to make sure it's got a positive internal rate of return. and if you can't demonstrate that, then we're not going to build it, and we're going to do more with just slightly less every single year. And that should be kind of burned into the backs of the minds of all the people that kind of pull the purse strings.
Okay, good. Next one.
I think the last one, if you can bring in a consultant, if you can bring in faculty, or you can bring in outside ideas to figure out ways that you can actually increase revenue to the school without raising tuition, making that an objective as well. So it's not just about cutting costs. Tuition can be anywhere from 15% to 50% of a school's budget. So the schools where tuition is a small amount, where do they get other resources? Are they selling their services to other areas? Are they more efficiently utilizing their facilities and campuses? Are they reaching out to the public community? Are they having camps on campus? Are they utilizing their research? Are they partnering with other businesses? Are they ensuring that there's kind of some sort of other series of revenue streams whereby these schools can contract? And that can also go a long way. If you have an engineering department, how many engineering companies are you working with on research and development or other projects and contracts? You've got brilliant professors and students. There's certainly synergies to be had and ways to be creative.
Yeah, I remember working with one client over in Saudi Arabia who had a consulting department, and they wanted me to go over and train faculty on how to be consultants. I mean, that's
interesting.
Certainly, yeah. So, well, we have come to the end of our time. David, thank you so much. What's next for you?
No, I appreciate that. I've got the book coming out in just a couple of weeks, and then I've got my fall class, and so that'll take me through December, and I've got 3 young kids, so I'm pretty busy. I have difficulty thinking out farther than 6 months, but I hope to be back. I'm excited. I've listened to your show in the past. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope your listeners enjoy this a little bit.
I am sure they will. David, thank you so much for being on the show. We greatly appreciate your thoughts and your time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to our guest, David Linton, and for his sharing with us the insights he learned about higher education and student debt while researching and writing his newest book, Crushed. Tune in next week for a real treat as we welcome Dr. Sethuraman Panchanathan, Director of the National Science Foundation, to the show. Panch will be sharing with us the latest news from NSF, including a number of new programs designed to help smaller universities land important research contracts that will help them collaborate on research with like-minded institutions. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.